Shalom. This week we begin the fourth of the 5 books of Moshe, the book of Numbers, in Hebrew known as Sefer Bamidbar, literally in the wilderness. And our Torah portion this week is Parashat Bamidbar. Chronologically speaking, after having completed the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, Israel's manual for holiness and the guide to the divine service in the temple, Torah now returns us to the reality of the present moment. The nation is preparing to soon enter the land that God swore to the forefathers. This book is about traveling. This whole book is not about getting there, but about being on the road. Just as our lives are not judged so much by what we achieved, but by how we behaved along the way, this book documents a life of being unsettled, being in transit, lots of stopovers, some long and some short. It's about way stations and the challenges that were met there, some tests that were passed and some dismal failures, but lots of waiting. And after God's decree of 40 years of wandering until the end of that generation, as we will learn in the portion of Shalach, then the waiting will be even longer. The word Midbar is often translated as the desert, but more accurately, Midbar is a wilderness, a place that is not fit for human habitation. You can't really be organized for living there. This is not a place for staying in, but for traversing and exiting as soon as possible. Later in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 19, Moshe will call it the great and awesome wilderness. The way is perilous and fraught with danger. Sworn enemies that seek to uproot and destroy the entire nation. Snakes and scorpions, which also represent the forces of evil that we all come up against as we travel through our own challenging situations in the various wildernesses of this world. The Midbar experience pits us against all that is adversarial. It takes effort to traverse this place. As Job said, it's the land whose darkness is like pitch blackness, a shadow of death, and without order. Yet this environment, by divine design, was to host the giving of the Torah, and it was to be the crucible for the formation of the people of Israel. And the timing, the divine synchrony of our reaching this book at this time is exquisite, because this coming Sunday night, we'll be welcoming the Festival of Shavuot, anniversary of the giving of the Torah, which took place at Mount Sinai in the Sinai wilderness. But what is it about this desert wilderness that God should choose it to be the place for him to give the Torah and for his people to prepare themselves for their lives in this world, to be lived with him? Why did Hashem decree that Israel's development as a nation should take place in this stark and foreboding place? So open up your heart. An elusive midrashic teaching tells us that the giving of the Torah was accompanied by 3 things: fire, water, and wilderness. The meaning is that somehow these 3 things were an integral part of the process which the nation had to go through in order to acquire Torah on a soul level. So what's the meaning of receiving Torah through fire, water, and wilderness? On a simple level, obviously we understand. The fire is the fire at Mount Sinai. As the Torah states in Parashat Yitro, in Exodus chapter 19, all of Mount Sinai was smoking because Hashem descended upon it in the fire. The water is the water of the Sea of Reeds, which they needed to cross, and also the tests of faith when there was no water to drink. And the Torah itself is also compared to water, as in Isaiah chapter 55, "Ho, whoever is thirsty, let him go to the water." And the Sinai wilderness, of course, is where God chose to give the Torah. But there's a deeper significance as well, and levels upon levels of meaning, each concept representing vast ideas. So open up your heart as we focus on the Midbar, the wilderness for which our 4th book is named. Our sages teach us that in order to truly acquire the words of Torah on a personal level, a person has to make himself open and ownerless like a Midbar. The wilderness is an environment that fosters and nurtures the attribute of humility. There's nothing there. So it's very chastising and chastening effect to be there. And the wilderness was chosen as the crucible of spiritual development because we live in a world of spiritual darkness full of snakes and scorpions that we need to learn to overcome if we seek to cling to Torah. And despite the foreboding nature of this place, the Torah itself praises the relationship between Israel and the Midbar, the wilderness, and Torah, making it clear that this was the perfect place for the giving of the Torah, for its spiritual acquisition, and for Israel's formative period. In the song of Parashat Chukat, later in Numbers chapter 21 and verse 18, the verse will describe the giving of the Torah in Hebrew as Midbar Matana, a gift from the wilderness. Commenting on this verse, our sages instruct us, why was the gift of the Torah given in the wilderness? in order to teach us that if one makes himself like a wilderness with a willingness to be trodden upon by all, again, the message of striving for humility, then Torah is given to him as a gift. In other words, God's choice of the desert symbolizes the level of humility and lack of ego that befits one who wishes to truly deserve to receive and internalize the message of Torah. And in Moshe's song of Parashat Ha'azinu in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 10, the verse recalls, he found them in a desert land and in a desolate, howling wasteland. He encompassed them and bestowed understanding upon them. He protected them as the pupil of his eye. In the Song of Songs, chapter 3, we find a verse, chapter 6, in verse 6, that praises Israel with the words, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness?" And in the words of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 2 and verse 2, Hashem himself expresses profound affection, recalling his early love for them and instructing the prophet, "Go out and call out in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, so said Hashem, I remember to you the loving kindness of your youth, the love of your wedding. You're following me in the desert, in a land not sown." Now, the Midrash Mechilta offers another idea regarding why Hashem specifically chose the Midbar, the wilderness, as the place to give his great gift of the Torah. Because as in an uninhabited place, no man's land, it was in order to avoid any controversy or strife between the tribes, so that none of them could say, the Torah is mine, it was given in my portion of the land. By giving the Torah in the wilderness, far from the habitat of the tribes of Israel, Hashem sought to remind the nation that Torah isn't the property of one particular tribe. It doesn't belong to one family or one stream. It was given to the entire nation equally. But open up your heart in the very deepest way. The Midrash elucidates further and states another idea, that just as these things, fire, water, and desert, are free to all, so too the Torah is free to all. In the same Midrash, our sages teach that if the Torah had been given in the land of Israel, open up your heart, then the nations of the world might have thought that they have no portion in it, that it's not for them. But it was presented in the wilderness, in no man's land, as it were, to teach that whoever wants it can come and get it, can come and receive it. Torah is designed to uplift this world and provide man with the opportunity to fulfill his human potential and to seek Hashem in this world and to strive to be the best person that a person can be. And therefore, all nations have a connection because the nature of Torah is universal in its very essence. Torah without borders. Torah for everyone. The Torah was revealed and bequeathed to its guardians, Israel, in the bleak and empty wilderness, no man's land, because it calls out, beckoning to all people everywhere, not to be denied and denying no one. The wilderness in which the children of Israel wandered for 40 years is an inhospitable place. Its life support systems are very minimal. Not much can live there, and not for any extended period. There's practically no water, little vegetation and wildlife, altogether a place you would think closer to the side of death than that of life. Nevertheless, our ability to acquire Torah on a soul level was implanted in us because we received it there, in that wild, howling place, reminding us that all are equal. We are reminded that we're all children of the same Father. So the Torah that eschews arrogance, whose understanding requires humility, and is all-embracing and accessible to all, reaching beyond borders and divisions, reaching beyond Israel's tribal divisions, refusing to be pegged with any particular party or stream, and indeed not restricted or confined to the nation of Israel, reaching beyond ethnicity altogether and social standing. In short, Torah is a divine expression of profound social justice for humanity. And by giving it in the wilderness, Hashem extended an invitation for anyone who desires his gift, providing an equal opportunity for all to draw close to God, to come and receive it. Chag Sameach, best wishes for a joyous festival of Shavuot. Shalom, dear friends. Thank you so much for your support. We appreciate it so very much. It's only your support that enables Jerusalem Lights to continue its outreach of Torah for everyone.